Today, let's talk about voting, shall we? And while we're voting, let's get these troops in a nice order. Voting. Voting is something in which is seen in an interesting manner. Some like it, some don't like it, some understand it, some don't understand it. But most of all, I think the thing about voting is to what degree voting matters or not depends heavily on the situation and your systems at play. The issue surrounding voting is in fact something entirely different, which I'll get to in 2 seconds. Just let me get into something quickly. I'm back. And while I talk, you can watch the footy battle. Yes, as I say, voting. What extent voting matters is quite interesting because it depends on how you see it. Voting in of itself is something in which can or can't impact things. The only extent of how it can affect is change of governments on occasion within the system. That is, of course, within pre-selected aspects of the system. And that itself is still very dubious in terms of what they can do. You can switch from one major party to another major party if you want. But to what extent that actually does anything depends heavily on other factors. The other factors that is impacted by it is instead by other things. The issue that Australia has, which is a common issue amongst other things as well, is that of the situation surrounding, well, to what extent power exists in the hands of the people. Often it's lacking. Hands of the people and democracy is two very interesting subjects in which needs to be talked about in relation to this. You can't just then assume that things will be all nice and lovely just because. It won't always be that way. The situation is, yes, you can vote at elections. But at the end of the story, outside elections, where does it matter? You can go to a protest and rally if you want. Does it impact anything? Does that help you in any way necessarily? Not hugely. Give me a second. Just let me sort out this stuff quickly.
Units have been deployed to the battlefield.
My point. The issue with elections is this. It's the only time you, as a non-lobbyist member, have any rights, necessarily. The issue with parliamentary systems is, once parliamentary systems is in place, people don't have much power. And the reason people don't have much power is because once in, lobbies and civil society groups get much, much more power in the long run. And when that happens, that is where a lot of these issues come to play. Donations to parties, which then run for Australia isn't as bad as America. America's much worse in terms of political culture, sure. Still, it is of note that Australia still accepts donations for campaign funding in terms of elections. It's still a very big red flag. That is where these issues lie. Yes. You can vote for Labour or Liberal or Greens or whatever you want. At the end of the day, once in, it is the lobbies much more than you. They'll do what they need to do, aka the bare minimum in some cases, to get your support. At the end of the day, voting itself is really secondary in the grand scheme of things. Because in actual day-to-day operations of the war surrounding political culture, the ones who have the power is not necessarily the ones who are the population of the country. Lobbies. Lobbies is the one which has much more power than actual regular civilians. Issue here is, again, well, what happens then? The government forms. The government has power. Of course, they can do some good things if it's the appropriate government. Of course. But the point is, there's no guarantee of that. There's no way to safeguard anything about the parliamentary procedures. There's nothing to guarantee anything at all, in fact. As I was saying, there's nothing to guarantee what promises said are to be done, and that's why, as we see, is the president. Unions essentially putting pressure, basically from day one, for the government to do what they need to do, or promised. Especially if it's related to... Sorry, give me a second. Especially if it's related to stuff surrounding promises about better rights or better conditions in work. That is promised. Pressure is on very early on because there's no real other solution. And that is something of a critical note. This is where I think much of this discussion needs to be held around. The other part of this is also about democracy itself. Democracy is something in which needs to be talked about in much more detail. Because the word democracy itself is really lacking. Because can you say democracy is a thing? Well, yeah. As I was saying about democracy as a principle only means a certain thing. It can mean so much to a certain extent, but then it means nothing if other factors are put in. The issue surrounding democracy is this. Democracy is one thing, but democracy is not everything. Democracy means only so much. Can democracy mean a lot? Some people, absolutely. At the same time, can democracy also mean a complete disaster? Yes. That is because of one simple fact. There is no uniform model of democracy. Uniformity is really not a common factor here. The common factor here is instead much more on the case of, well, what is the ongoing thing surrounding what is pairing with democracy. This relates very much to the question of... I should stop looking at random people. Anyway, continuing. I was saying, what democracy is paired with matters. Libertarian democracy, liberal democracy, ex-democracy for other things. It matters a lot Because democracy is only by the technicality of allowing rights and votes. But at the end of the story, outside of that, is there like a huge other aspect to it? Yes and no. The issue surrounding democracy is often people just say democracy as a descriptor. Some say liberal democracy, which is much better because it's much more specific. But some people still just think democracy is democracy is democracy when it's actually wrong. Democracy is something in which, to some extent, matters, but also does not matter to another extent. People need to understand that is the reality of this, and people need to stop being so selfish, basically, surrounding democracy. Because just because you have democracy as well doesn't mean you are going to be inherently a better person. Save. Fuck this one. Wait, I'm just gonna reload that one. That was a. Oof, need better choose. Need to special choose for that one. Whatever. I'll try and cut attack Glenmore battle position instead. That's a better idea. Hopefully this one isn't as terrible set up. Okay, this is better. As I was saying, democracy. That's the issue. The capitalist democracy we live in doesn't prioritize our own rights. The rights of a civilian is secondary in terms of capitalist democracy to the primary people, which is the capitalists themselves. Media regulation as well needs to be done majorly. The issue surrounding this as well is escalated because, as we see with like Australian media as well, multinationals then can actually get in the way of the processes which then can distort whole entire elections. This is as we've seen with stuff around the leader of the Labour Party before, Albanese, which was Bill Shorten. He was assassinated politically by media. And this is where the question of influence, the question of where influence lays, where loyalties is quite important. Also, where you're getting information from specifically matters as well. You can't just declare that any information is fine. At the end of the day, bias still is a contributing factor to much of this conflict surrounding politics. Bias, distortion of facts, and also lobbying inside of the parliamentary bubble as well is also a major factor here. Money that goes straight into the parties can influence many, many things. Liberal democracy is inherently quite weak to this sort of influence because they have no real safeguard against it due to the nature of them supporting capitalism in a quite pure fashion, allowing capitalist influence within politics. And once you do that, that's a path line to what can cause quite a bit of trouble. I can't say that some people understand it, some people don't. It all really depends on the situation. I wish some understood more better than others, but some just don't learn. And that is where we are at now. This is where it connects back to voting. Because if this was down to like purely voting in a pure form, where everyone had a complete freedom to vote on election to election based on what they understand or know or care about, that would be different. But this is the situation. Australia doesn't have a voting system like America or the UK. It has mandatory or compulsory voting, meaning if you vote one thing, you're essentially trapped on the roster forever. And frankly, there's a huge problem because 91% of the population, I think that's some still, but the point is that there's a quite large number of people just on the roster. So, yes, technically speaking, the nation is quote unquote represented, but also, at the same time, I'm just gonna get out of here quickly and then recap. As I was saying, misinformation. Misinformation being so large in potential impacts things majorly here. Because allowing such misinformation and then it's the social media as well, on top of everything else. All of this factors in a lot too much of this issue surrounding us. By having much of these issues, it makes a new problem dilemma. What do you then do surrounding crises of where there's an issue? Look at the debacle around how they're doing in China right now. Labour Party is still basically being a puppet. So, but I'm back. As I was saying, the whole situation surrounding this is actually quite kind of interesting as a whole, because then it puts into question if there's much of the audience which is ignorant in the first place. How then do you know if it's a true vote of actual aware voting? And that is where I think that should be put into question. People should question more in general, anyway, but that's not the point. The point is more so that we need to be just more aware of the situation as a whole. And that's my general message here, is that democracy, elections, so on, they matter and they don't matter. Don't take it. I mean, it's not to you, but don't. But it's not always a sacred duty by any means or stretch of imagination. That's all. That's all I'm really saying here. And